Okay, tonight what we're going to do is we're going to continue on our little series of classes on how to build a tree correctly over on Family Search. The reason I'm doing this is I look at different groups on Facebook that cater to people using Family Search, as I review the people that I've had to work with at the center over the years, and realize that there's a lot of real basic stuff about Family Search that we just don't know. Most of us just don't know it. And so what we're trying to do is present all these little things about the tree that we really should understand and comprehend so that we can do a good job in building our tree. So tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on standardizing. We'll talk about standardizing names, places, and dates. We'll also talk a little bit about the rules on people's names in tree, and then updating facts and a few little tricks and ideas and things you need to realize about changing and editing facts, updating facts when you use sources and things like that. And then we'll talk a little bit about your attempts to grow a tree and about adding people to tree and how we should do that properly, the things we need to be aware of and concerned about, and especially stressing the fact that we need to always look for duplicates, no matter what the system tells us as we're adding people. Because the system will often say there's no duplicates when in fact there really are. And we'll talk a little bit about how to find those. So, standardization. Why do they use this? Okay, well, the thing is, behind the scenes, something that we might not be aware of is that there's a mathematical algorithm being used to help find people when we ask to find someone with a search. And that mathematical algorithm is tied to the record that we're working with or the search terms that we put in as we search for somebody and the records that are out there, and they try to find good matches. And one of the ways you can really improve the searching is by using standardized dates and places and names and things like that, so that the system will recognize them better, because a standardized date or place is more readable by the program. The program knows it and is more, more willing to help you get a match if your things are standardized than if they're not. I hear somebody in the background. If you could mute, that would really be nice. Okay, the key point here is that we want to align what we're doing with the system. We may not feel like it's that important, but quite truly, it really is. So on standardizing dates, this is a good example. I'm in on a birth fact, and I just want to do a birth fact for somebody, and I've entered it in a form that the system doesn't like. I'm using just numbers, so it's not standardized. And so what I want to do, even if I type it in the way that would be standardized, right below it is going to be a little box where you're going to have a grade N value there. Now, that grade N value is the standardized value. And you want to click on that, whether we're talking about dates or places. We want to standardize them if at all possible, so that it's something the system fully recognizes. Then in addition to doing the standard itself, we're also going to want to fill in the reason box with why we did what we did. And in this case, it's where did this come from? And it came from a Missouri death certificate. And so we want to add that basic information in there so that it will show up in the record and people will know this is why you did what you did. And then, of course, make sure you click save. when you do these things, when you do edits, because if you don't, it's not going to be recorded. Okay, places are always tricky. And Family Search is not perfect with this, and we understand that. It's really physically, I think, impossible to develop a perfect standardization of places for every known place on this planet. You might think, well, sure, they could pull that off, but there's really millions of places, and places have different standards based on different times. Plymouth, Massachusetts hasn't always been in Massachusetts. And so we have to be able to try to standardize things if we can. If they don't have a standard, we can always just go after, we type in what we have and nothing comes up that meets the standard that we need for that place. Just click outside the box. It'll leave what you typed in there, but of course it's going to be marked as not standard. But if it needs to be there, that's the price you're going to have to pay. If it can be standardized, we're going to try to standardize it. And Family Search does a pretty good job. When you start typing in a place, like I'm typing in St. Joseph, Buchanan County, Missouri, and I only got as far as the BUCH, and they've already decided I must be looking for St. Joseph, Buchanan, Missouri, United States, and they're telling me it's a city, and this is a good standard for the time period of 1838 to the present. And so since the date I'm using is 1929, that's obviously after 1828, I can go ahead and click on that standard and it will fill it in for me. What you'll often find is you'll find 2 or 3 different standards for a location based on whether it had different names, like when you're talking about colonies, and so a place might be in the state of New York today, where in the 1600s it would have been in the colony of New York, and so they'll put in there different standards that you can pick from based on the time period. And sometimes based on whether it's a city or a county or an unincorporated area or whatever it might be. So sometimes you'll have 3 or 4 to pick from. Now, like I say, it's not perfect. Sometimes there won't be anything to pick. And if that's the case, just click outside the box and it'll leave what you typed in. Okay, person name rule. Names do matter a lot on Family Search. It matters a lot to us when we do research. And what we need to do is we need to make sure we understand the 2 places that we put names in, understand those boxes, try to enter as complete a name as possible for people, put the names in the proper boxes, learn to use alternative names properly. Some of us aren't really that familiar with the alternative name area, and that's really important to understand. And don't put in the name boxes words the system doesn't accept, and especially if you're doing temple work and you're submitting names for the temple, make sure you enter the names properly and follow the rules, or you won't be able to clear the name. Okay, so understanding the 2 different places that we can put names. I pulled up a section of a person's person page. Actually, it's mine. And I'm showing you that there's 2 areas. Up in the vitals, there's a place for names. And if you're doing ordnance work, that particular field's the one where you don't want anything but alpha characters. You don't want any symbols or any special little extra things on the name there. And then down below there under other information, you're going to have a place where you can put alternative names. And by the way, I skipped over one other fact up there. On that name, it's normally going to be the birth name. Sometimes there's a need to use a different name for some reason. And so like my father-in-law, who was adopted, everybody on the face of the earth that knew him as Robert John Blessing. We found his biological mother. We know his birth name was Charles Edward Gray, but only that biological mother, my father-in-law, and the immediate family knew that name. And so it would be almost ludicrous to put him in that box as Charles Edward Gray, because nobody would ever recognize him. And they'd want to go out and create records for Robert John Blessing. So we would put Robert John Blessing up there, and then down in this other area where there's alternate names, we would put a name down there and call it his birth name, so that it would be able to show up. Now, what's nice is when somebody goes to search for him, all the different names that are entered are actually being searched. So the name that's up there in the vitals under name, and all the names down in the alternate names are all searchable and are searched when somebody comes looking for us. So if somebody's looking for me and they never knew my given name was Robert, they only knew me by Bob, they could search for me by Bob and the name would come up. May not come up at the top of the list, but it will come up because Bob is one of my alternate names. I've got it listed as a nickname. I have also known as Robert E. Givens because that's the business name that I use. And so just understand that the alternate names are also searched. You don't have to get hung up on, well, I've got to have all the name up there under name in the vitals so that people can find it, because they can also find it if it's down here in these alternate names. Okay, so just remember that when you're working on names. Enter the name as complete as possible. Now, sometimes you don't know much. When you're doing a record, you may only be given the mother's first name. But, record what you do know and record it in the correct boxes. Notice that there's a template form here. For most of us, it's set as English, but it can be set for other languages so that the names can be entered in the format that that language uses. And these boxes will change based on the language that is being used. So under first names, that's tricky because that means, in our case, English, it means the first and all middle names go in that first box. Then the names that are actually last names go in the second box. And of course, if you're Hispanic, you could have two names there because of the surname and then the mother's maiden name. Also understand that on women, we prefer and want their maiden name. If we don't know their maiden name, usually the best thing to do is to leave that blank. Though there are times you're going to put in the husband's last name, but that really is kind of problematic in most cases. So that box should be for maiden names. Then you have a box for titles. Those are the names, the words that precede first names, such as captain, governor, president, things like that. And the suffixes are where you would find like DDS or doctor or senior or junior or the Roman numeral 3. Those don't go in the last name box. And just as an FYI, for doing temple work, it's preferable that you don't have titles and suffixes on the name when you actually do the ordnance work, what you have on the card. Try to not have those there. And then after you get the work done, then go in and add the titles and suffix so that they don't become part of the official record for that person, because those really aren't part of their names. Those are just extra things that are added in most cases. Sometimes there isn't a junior is part of the name, or a 3. We're not born senior. So, technically that's not part of your name at birth. So it doesn't necessarily even have to be there. Okay. Ordnance system doesn't like certain words. So as you're doing work, don't fill in boxes with baby or dead or girl or infant or, things like that. Son, stillborn, twin. Leave those things out. Now, there are some languages where son and even the word man are actually parts of names in their language. And when we worked in Salt Lake in data quality, what would have to be done, these are usually Oriental lines, they would have to submit the name they needed done if it had son in it, if that was the last name, had to submit it to data quality. We could create the card for the person and then send it to them so they could do the work, because the system just simply would not clear it for them. So try to leave out these kind of words. There's actually more. I just picked the most common ones. But try to leave these out because the system won't accept them under normal circumstances. Okay, now updating existing facts. It would be so nice in many cases, we think, if when we are doing, like in this case, adding a source and the source comes with better data, that we would just be able to overwrite what was on that person's record. And that would be what those of us that are researchers would like to see happen. Family Search had a different take on this. And that is that if they set it up so, like in this case, where the record for the person only says 1897, and this source has a full birth date, we would like to just override it. Family Search said, no, we don't want to do that because some people that don't understand what's going on could overwrite good dates with partial dates, overwrite a full date with a partial date because they don't know any better. And somebody that might truly not understand the person's record might come across a source that's incorrect. And because it says in this case, maybe 1899 for the person's birth, I'm going to put it in there. When in fact, there's 10 sources that all say it was 1897. And so what Family Search decided on was, rather than doing it the way some other companies do it, we won't name names, is that we would require the patron to manually make changes if there's already a value there. So since there's a value there, we can't just slide that full date in there. We're going to have to manually do that. We're going to have to manually add it. We have to do that for locations and also for names. If there's any value for a name, a date, or a place already in the system, you can't override it with the source automatically. Now, there are some things on this particular source that there weren't equivalents for. Those we're going to be able to add onto the record. And we want to make sure where it says add, that we actually bring those into the record, because they don't come over automatically. You've got to physically say, okay, I want to put them over there. And so as you go through, you'll be able to add those in. But in this case, we can't change the birth, and the death dates match. So there's no need to make any change there. Okay, here's another example. I've got a record where I know a woman only by her first name, Thirza, or Thirza, however it's pronounced. A source comes along, a marriage registration, which of course has last names, and we now know her last name is Kenton. Well, I can't put it, I just can't slide it over there. I'm going to have to enter this by hand. Okay, it's just the way the system works. We have to accept that we have to play the game the way the system plays it, or we can't play. So doing the actual updates in these cases, go to the person's page, and it'll be easier than you think now, because now we can see the sources that have been tagged for that fact. So when I go to Thyrsa's record and I click on her name, it now has some sources over there that show her with her last name. There's one time there where it shows her maiden name. The one below it has a different last name because that's her last name on a census. So that's her married name. But I do see there's a Kenton there. And so I'm going to take that Kenton and add it in as the last name. And then I can go down there and explain that the maiden name was added from a source. And I probably should have said from her marriage registration index. But the point is, it's right up there on the page. I really like this extra little feature that's been added by Family Search of showing you all the tag sources for this particular fact for this person, and they're right here, and I can see the values that are on those sources. So it makes making the edits pretty easy. And then remember, click Save when you're done. Same thing goes for place or dates and places. In this case, a date. Okay, we only have a year date on the person's record. That's the best we had. But we found a source. The 1900 census says it was March of 1897. It wouldn't let us automatically put it in, so we have to come over here. We go and erase the old date. We put the new date in. And then we go and explain why we did it. The 1900 census provided March 1897 rather than just the year. And then, of course, click Save, even though I don't have Save on the screen this time. Okay, adding people to tree. Once we've gotten the handle on all this correcting of dates and places and names and how to do that, we're ready to try to put some new people into tree and see what kind of minefields we have to tramp through to do that. So when we add people to tree, we really want to try to be careful. Try to put as many sources on a record as you can to fully identify them, and cautiously search for duplicates. Family Search is not always going to find the duplicate. They try not to overdo that because they really got burned in the early stages of New Family Search by being very generous, figuring, well, the patrons would be able to determine if it really is a duplicate or not. And what it turned out to be was, if Family Search says it's a duplicate, it's a duplicate. Even if I'm working on John Jones and the duplicate they give me is Sam Smith, I'm going to merge them because Family Search said they're duplicates. So Family Search learned real quick that if they make suggestions, oftentimes many people will just go with the flow and not really analyze it. So they try to make sure the duplicates are high quality. So therefore they miss a lot that we need to be aware of and look for. And we'll find there are ways to find these people. So here's a family to grow. I was doing my descendancy research because I have a full tree, and I came upon Hiram Robert Floyd. He's my third cousin, 4 times removed, and there's our pedigree. He goes through my mother's side of the family. I was working on her Sands ancestors, and Hiram shows up. Unfortunately, Hiram doesn't really have much of a full family. There's not a lot known about him. There's 4 sources for the guy, so that's nice, but he's got a wife listed, Mary Floyd, but no children. And even the family that he's in He has parents of their names, but there's no other children, just him. So it's kind of one of those families that you think, oh, maybe there's some more people here. And so, it seems possible he should have children. Doesn't always happen, but we'll see what we can do. And so we'll look at those 4 sources. Now, the last source on there I added recently, and I did not source it all, and that's why it says unfinished. But I didn't want to forget that I had that source, so I just stuck it on him and didn't do anything else with it, even though there was other information. Okay, but as I looked at this, the other 3 sources are all censuses in 1900, 1910, 1940. That 1940 census is very interesting because it shows 5 children, and Family Search shows them with 0 children. Well, when I looked at them, I realized why they weren't showing, because whoever put this record in sourced Hiram and wisely left the children alone, because they're all born within the last 110 years. And they really should know if they're dead or not before they put them into Family Search. And so I can kind of see the reasoning behind it, but I'm still curious about whether those kids can be entered or not, because even though they're inside 110, it's possible that some of them are deceased. So are the kids alive or dead? Well, determining their status really wasn't very hard. All I had to do was find their dad on Find a Grave. And on his memorial was listed his wife over here, Mary Leah Hearn Floyd, with her birth year and death year, and 7 children, 2 more than that census even shows, all deceased. In fact, all 5 of those children on that census are dead. And so they can all be put into Family Search. So the question you might ask is, so why would we even want to add them? They're inside the 110 years. I can't do temple work for them. My thought, though, is, okay, they are dead. Why not put them in tree and have them sitting there when the family comes along, they're already in the system for them. It's just one of those things I don't mind doing. It doesn't bother me. They're my cousins. And so I'm not planning to do the temple work for any of them, but I'm happy to put them in there so that someday when the family does find this, and eventually someone will, it'll be there for them. So this is going to take a little bit of work because we have a census that has very little data. And now we have Find a Grave, where each of these children has their own memorial where it shows birth and death and burial information. Some of them have obituaries. Some have headstone pictures. There's a lot of good data there. So how are we going to deal with that? Well, we'll go over to the census. And the first thing we ought to do is look at this census record and see if there's anything we can learn from it. What we'll do is we'll attach Irene, this first child, to Family Search, but we're going to use the Find a Grave information on her to update what Family Search would get from the census. So when we click add, it starts filling in the information. Then I went in. Her name's really Gertrude Irene, so I changed it to Gertrude Irene. Instead of 1921 for her birth, I gave her full birth. And what it said on her memorial at Find a Grave, she was born in Minnesota. Well, actually, born in Minnesota came from the census. And then for the death information, the full death date, and Minnesota's what was mentioned on her Find a Grave memorial. And then I just had found as a record of her burial. Now, the reason I'm able to fill this in is when I clicked add, with that little bit of information Family Search had on her from the census, it could not find a duplicate. And so I'm able to go in here and fill these in. There were no duplicates offered. So I'll just go ahead and I'll create a new person. And later on, if I find a duplicate, I'll merge them. But I'll complete this now that I've created a record for Gertrude. It'll actually go source the census and put in what was on the census. It's in addition to what we have already. In other words, her residency in 1935 and where she was living in 1940 on the census. Notice that it's filling in her name, her birth, and sex for the tags for this source. I mark on there that information from Find a Grave was added to the basic information from the census, because obviously they don't get a full birth date and things like that from a census. Okay, then click Attach. Now, I filled out the information on her. If there's 2 children from that Find a Grave that weren't on the census. So after I went through the census and put all the kids in, adding Find a Grave's information, I had a couple of kids left to fill in. Well, make sure when I put them in, I need to mark their sex, and I also need to mark their status, that they're deceased. And then I can go ahead and fill in the information on them by clicking Add a Child, fill in the boxes. So this is one of those missing children with all the information from Find a Grave. Click Next. It goes looking for Robert L. Floyd, and it says no match found. So I went ahead and said, let's create that person. And he's in the tree, and eventually we have 7 children. None of those kids were in tree, but that wasn't surprising because they're all within the 110-year rule. Now, that's one extreme. That's the easy extreme where your family really is new. You really are adding some new people. Now, sometimes it's a little trickier. I also am related to a Lyman Clark who's married to a Mary Ann Payne. And in Family Search, that's all there is Lyman and Mary and no children. Well, I was looking at Find a Grave again, one of my favorite sites, and notice this is a person born back in the 1700s, 1792. And so you would think, well, there'll be all kinds of records. There's actually only 2 records in Family Search on this man. There's very few records that are found. The one thing I did notice, though, looking at his family, he has several siblings. All those siblings have families, well-developed families with several kids, a spouse and several kids, and the kids are married and they have descendants. And Lyman's here with a wife and no kids, which right there is a red flag. Now, it's possible they had no children, but if you look on Find a Grave, there's at least 2, because 2 children down here have been linked to him and Mary. And so it's very possible there's maybe even more children. This is one of those cases where the system may let me put people in, but it's possible they're already there and something's happened to this family. I've found many families where the children were just dispersed. They were all separated from their parents. They're all floating around in tree, possibly with their spouses and kids, but they're not tied to parents anymore. So this is what I'm kind of expecting to have happen. So he was alive until, until 1871. So I'd like to see the 1850 census, but I can't find it. I go on Family Search and I search. He's going to be alive for 21 more years. Where in the heck is he? So I use my investigative skills and I go over to Ancestry. That's why we have these partner accounts. And I find him from one of the records that we already have on him, and then look at the other records that go with it. And here's a link to the 1850 census. So I go look at it, and it's transcribed over at Ancestry as Layman. Leyman, Clark, instead of Lyman. And it shows him born in Rhode Island instead of, I think it's Connecticut. And so that's enough to where Family Search will never find him. And so, but I know now what I probably need to do. I need to go back to Family Search and do a search and make the change to Leyman, Leyman, and see what happens. And sure enough, I do that search and there's that 1850 census. So what does the 1850 census tell us? Well, we've got us a family. We've got Lyman, and he's living in East Lyme in Connecticut, which is where he should be. And there's no wife listed on this census. So the assumption would be that Mary Ann's probably died. We don't have a death date on her. Divorce was kind of uncommon in those days. Possible that they're divorced, but more likely that she has passed away. And so the last child was born in 1826, if these are in fact their children. And we can't verify that yet at that point, but she's had a lot of years since then to pass away. And then there's all these kids, or supposed kids. So I went back over to Ancestry and I looked at the trees that are there to find that there were dozens of trees with Lyman and Mary and these children. Okay, so these are all listed as children by these many different people. So I can feel fairly safe that they probably are children. We're still going to need to verify that with other records and things like that. But it appears that they're children. And in fact, when I go looking at the trees there, most trees had 2 more kids. They also had a Charlotte Antoinette and a John Clark that are not on the 1850 census, but that's very possible because they had to have been married probably around 1820 or so, or even earlier. So it's very possible they've got children that are out of the home or had died. Okay, so let's start linking these kids with the thought that we're probably going to run into duplicates. So I just start with the very first child on the list, William. Now these kids, this census is such that the children aren't automatically placed in the record as children. So I had to drag William from at the bottom of the screen up there and drop him in as a child in the family so that I can create a record for him. And then I clicked add, and the system doesn't have him. It didn't find a duplicate. So it has that information, and we'll go ahead and create a record for him based on that. But in the back of my mind, I'm going to keep thinking, I'm going to keep looking for a William E. Clark because it's possible he's out there somewhere. It seems more likely that he's out there than that he's not in the system at all. Okay, so how does these possible duplicates work? Again, it's an all mathematical system. They're comparing the records you have with the records that are out there in the tree and trying to find a real consistent record that appears to be just like the one you have. And they have a rating system. It's a 5-point system. It has to qualify at a 4-point level to even be called a possible duplicate. Now, why don't these census records get duplicates? The problem with census records is there's just not much information there. And without much information, they're not going to register many matches. We just have to understand it. At this point, we're not going to probably find much. And this is why we want to do something so that we can find some possible matches. And that what we do is add more sources that add birth, marriage, and death information. And most importantly, if there are any, add spouses, children, parents, because when we start getting those linkages, the duplicates start showing up. Now, there is one place we can go look, and that's on his person page. Under tools, we can go to find similar people, and we can dig through those records and see if we can find one that comes up that wasn't marked as a duplicate, because there are no duplicates. It says 0 duplicates right here. But it's possible on that similar people's page, we'll find one that is in fact is a duplicate. Okay, now sometimes we need our other site help, our subscriptions to these other portal premium sites. And so since there really wasn't much on William E. Clark on Family Search, I said, okay, let's go over to Ancestry. I now have him on the 1850 census. So I went and found him at Ancestry on the 1850 census. And over on the side of the record, they show you other records that might be this person. And one of them is Find a Grave. At this point, all I know is year of birth, place of birth, and name. And this comes up, and it's for a place in New London, Connecticut, where part of the family is, Nyack. And it says he's married to an Emma Clark. It's an interesting stone. There is not a companion stone. This is Emma's stone. There isn't a companion stone for William. In fact, his name is in that arch at the top, and underneath that arch where there should be a birth and death field, there's nothing. And so most likely he's not buried there. I'm suspecting Emma died and he married again, and he's buried with the other wife, because that happens a lot. But I have a clue here that he's married to an Emma. So I go looking for William E. Clark, and in the 1880 census, I find him over at Ancestry again. On that list of possible sources, there's an 1880 census for a William E. Chuck. Well, if you think of Chuck and Clark, you can see where sloppy handwriting could easily be read as Chuck. Okay, but there's William and Emma, and they're living in the home of David and Cordelia Howard, and Emma's a daughter of David and Cordelia. So her last name must be Howard, should be Howard. So is it an incorrect transcription? But I believe this to be my person. And so what we'll do is we'll attempt to add an Emma Howard as the wife of William Clark in Family Search, so that he'll have a wife. We'll take from the census the information that she would have been born about 1841. It says she was born in Connecticut, and I know that she died before 1900 because I find him on a census, but she's not there. So we assume she died. So we'll use that little bit of information, try to create her as a spouse. And when I hit enter for the system to check, it came up with a way I could add create a person. If there's no match, I just say create person. But in this case, there's one match. And it's an Emma Howard with exactly what I put in, 1841 Connecticut, and a spouse already in tree, William E. Clark. And William has parents that are the same names as the parents that we already had. So there was a duplicate for William already in tree, and Emma's already connected to him, and he has duplicate parents. So like I said, that's what I expected to find, and I did. So because everything agrees, I go ahead and say add match. And so now I have a problem in that I have two William Clarks. You'll notice that Emma Howard is on over here. Both Emma Howard wives are boxed in. That's because they're the same exact record. I'm on her record. She has a William Clark with one ID there and a William Clark with a different ID there. So now we're going to have to merge the two husbands so that we have just one. So I'm going to take the one that I had, merge it in with the one that was already there. And that's not surprising. That's kind of what I expected to see happen. Even though the system says there's no duplicates, and she has two husbands with the same names and the same data, the system says there's no duplicates. So I say you really have to stay alert and keep your eyes open. Okay, we'll do a merge by ID, and when we're done and we get all the different merges done, William now is a part of the family. He's got a wife. We don't show any kids. There really are two. I haven't added them in yet. Charlotte and John. Wait a minute, Charlotte and John belong to the Lyman and Mary Ann Payne. What I did find is that all those children that are showing were already in tree, except for one, Ray. Ray was the only child that actually had to be created. Everybody else had a duplicate floating around in there. Okay, I had the question asked, why didn't I update the Emma Howard stuff? Mainly because I didn't have time, but I'll get to it. Yeah, for the case of this, I'm just concerned about trying to show you how we're working on the Clark family themselves. But yeah, there was more information on Emma as I went. And over at Ancestry, there's more information on Charlotte and John, and they can get added to the tree. So that's pretty much it. Let me stop the recording and we'll go to our questioning.